Yes, it sounds terribly theoretical, and it is a little bit. So I'll try to break it down. The problem is if you take all the rhetoric of an article away, you are sometimes shocked with what remains, because it's a bit vague. This argument, and you might think it's to some extent tenuous, and I think a lot of reviewers might sometimes also see that, judging by the long-suffering history of this article, which is still waiting to be published. It's just that most people, when they hear USSR, they think rightly about republics and territorial autonomy, not at all about NTA. And if they even, historians of Soviet history, they usually haven't even heard of that abbreviation. They might think you're talking about NTD, National Territorial Delimitation, the creation of national republics and all that. And if you start talking about NTA, they just raise their eyebrows. Some, and maybe I'm doing them injustice, but some they have heard of Austro-Marxists, because especially the early works, the broader pipes, and in the 90s and 80s works that when on the whole Soviet Union looked at Bauer and Renner and acknowledged that there was some influence of Bauer's theory of nationhood, for instance, on Stalin's concept of nationhood. But usually what people know is that Lenin and Stalin explicitly rejected this idea of the Renner's and Bauer's ideas of cultural autonomy, they didn't call it non-territorial autonomy, but cultural autonomy, as it was known in the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. So, and that is what shapes our picture of Soviet nationality policy. Forgotten actually. Let me share my screen so you can see Can you see the thing?
Yes.
PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Good.
It's okay.
So I grappled with this for a long time, and this is just a part of this problem. I came across a letter by a young historian. In 1929, he wrote to Stalin asking him if he could act as a supervisor, Vasily Kasatkin. And he basically wanted guidance from Stalin about how to conceptualize nationhood. When did nations emerge? He had legions of questions about how Soviet nationality policy in a way would continue, but he didn't say that explicitly. He cloaked it in questions about theory. And it struck me because he says, I openly admit that I don't understand. And I have to laugh because I also didn't quite understand how Stalin and Lenin always justified this policy of patronizing national culture, where before the revolution they clearly said that the national culture is fool and we have to focus on international culture and growing proletarian unity. And I looked at his letter and I realized that this guy seems to be feeling that there's change in the air, and that maybe this policy of patronage of national cultures, indigenization, Korenizacja as it was called, that this might be coming to an end. So he asked Stalin, listen, is it right that we, and this is sort of a quote, I paraphrase, is it right that we, when we define nationhood, define it separately from the state, independently of the state? Why is it that, he asked Stalin, bourgeois nationalists and national theory of the nation, bourgeois theory of the nation relies so much on culture, but we don't? And wouldn't it be better to take more into account this striving of a nation for independence, and in general this criterion of statehood? And he doesn't mention Austro-Marxism or Bauer or Renner, but obviously, given that that's what the Austro-Marxists that was the core of their theory, that you would separate the nation from the state and try to divide the nation from the state by conceptualizing it more in cultural terms. He didn't mention this explicitly, this young Kasatkin, But Stalin's response to his letter made quite clear that this is what Stalin read between the lines. He said that, no, this our nationalist policy is all right, and to do anything else, it's all right, and please don't confuse it with Autobauerism, Autobauerroshina, he called it. And this is Autobauer. And the Austro-Marxists to conceptualize sort of an Austrian, socialist Austria, where nation and statehood would to some extent be separate. And let me just see if I skipped something. As I said, in a way, Kasatkin was feeling that maybe things are about to change. The new economic policy was also coming to an end. That had been a compromise with elements of the free market. So he and other Bolsheviks probably just felt that, maybe indigenization, maybe our nationalities policy, our support for national culture will also come to an end. And he and other Bolsheviks began testing the limits of this, what has been called the affirmative action empire by Terry Martin. And one way of doing this was basically by emphasizing that it is too much reminiscent of this Austro-Marxist emphasis on national culture and support for national culture. And this is, for instance, an Armenian Bolshevik who wrote in his book 1927 about national culture that, we haven't yet departed in the Soviet Union too far from these Austro-Marxist and Bund Menschewik views on national culture. And this was also, basically Kasatkin's point. And I already told you that he suggested to Stalin, well, maybe we can even change Stalin's definition of the nation. As you might know, he has this territorial, psychological commonalities and so on and so forth. And Kasatkin said, let's add the striving for a nation state to this. And in a way, if that had happened, the Soviet Union would have become less indigenizing, because it basically would have meant, look, those who have national territory now, they are nations, and this thing has been solved. Let's now not exaggerate with this policy of cultural patronage support, language and culture. But Stalin responded in a couple, the same year, a couple of weeks later, totally rejecting what Kasatkin had written, and saying that, look, I understand that you might find this irritating that we are pursuing this policy of cultural support for nationalities, but in the long-term future, we are still wanting to see the merging of all nations. So this is totally different from what the Austro-Marxists wanted, because they wanted to permanently institutionalize this national difference, and we don't. But if you think about it in practical terms, well, and Stalin admitted it himself, quoting Lenin, he said that whether these national differences, they will remain for a very, very long time, even after the global triumph of socialism. Well, that means basically, I'll do the washing one day. It's obviously a fig leaf to just detract from the fact that they are institutionalizing national difference permanently. And since Stalin was one of Bauer's fiercest critics, he must have known that his approach or the Bolshevik Soviet approach, to provide predominantly cultural autonomy within a single socialist state, or let's say to see nations as predominantly cultural entities whose needs could be met by meeting their predominantly cultural needs, shared something with the Austro-Marxist approach. Now, I know that there were republics, and not for everyone, but if you look at the fact that it was also a unitary centralizing state, these republics the borders weren't that terribly important. What really mattered mattered more was the promotion of national culture and cadres. And so he completely dismissed Kasatkin's suggestion, saying that this would be both politically and theoretically wrong. Then he... this was yeah. So instead of admitting that there was anything Austro-Marxist in his theory, he started Stalin started claiming in his letter that this was a thoroughly Russian Marxist-Leninist theory of nationhood. And Stalin writes another sort of an open letter to Kasatkin, but not to him personally, but to people like him who criticize this reliance on national culture. So he writes in this open letter in 1929 that he has apparently received a couple of letters from various comrades criticizing his definition of nationhood and suggesting that there should be more emphasis on territorial statehood. And in actually trying to prove that this Soviet nationalist policy in theory is utterly Russian and Marxist, he again betrays the similarities to Austro-Marxism, because he said, we are having these socialist nations here, which are much more conflict-free, class conflict-free, much more cohesive, and they are much more viable than the bourgeois nations. And therefore they will last longer. And this is a totally different story from what the cultural autonomy people wanted with their bourgeois nationalism. But if you actually look at what Renner and Bauer said, they exactly spoke of this similar utopia of the proletariat participating in national culture, the nation becoming the possession of the proletariat, the nation becoming unified, conflict-free, and lasting. Then, to move on, this is Karl Kautsky, influential Marxist thinker, Austrian, Czech, German, social democrat, who was critical of Renner and Bauer, who's also mentioned in Kasatkin's letter and Stalin's letter, and whose criticism of the Austro-Marxists was one of those, perhaps the most important channel through which Stalin and Lenin also formulated their own critique of Renner and Bauer. And he always criticized the Austro-Marxists, he is Kautsky, for basically diminishing, for exaggerating the reality of the nation and of national culture. He said, look, nations are essentially a matter of language, it's a formality. And you shouldn't give it too much credit. And Bauer responded to Kautsky, saying that, no, this is wrong. If you, especially we socialists, ignore nationalism or try to diminish it, belittle it as only a formal matter of language, we don't understand it and we will never manage to defeat it. We have to, fight fire with fire. We have to join, basically, in the national struggle. We have to explain to the workers that that nationalist and socialist demands go hand in hand. And it's okay to do that. It's not just a cynical strategy, it's legitimate. And Kautsky said, what you're doing is, to Bauer said, well, what you're proposing here is you just want to reform nationalism. You want to create some sort of special kind of nationalism, which is devoid of aggression and violence. And if you are familiar with Stalin and Lenin's critique of Austro-Marxism, that's exactly what they said. They called it a subtle, refined, they called Austro-Marxist ideas of national autonomy and nationalism as a refined, subtle form of nationalism that tries to sort of lure the workers into accepting it. Instead, of course, of admitting that Stalin and Lenin, instead that they would not admit that they had been influenced by Kautsky, and Kasatkin actually writes to Stalin that, look, you've criticized Kautsky for saying that there will be soon a global socialist language, replacing all other languages. In 1925, Stalin had said, this is nonsense, this is assimilationist. And Stalin was confused by this. He said, well, I thought you agreed with him, now you're saying he's wrong, so when will we have one language and all that? How will this work? Stalin said, no, he's wrong, he's a dilettante, Kautsky. We stand for the support for national cultures, we stand for flourishing national languages, and we are against assimilation, and Kautsky was wrong. And if he, this was exactly what Entan would have, and did actually say to Kautsky when he argued with that. So this is what I mean with on common ground. And the same Kautsky debate goes on with this. It had another influence on Soviet nationalities policy. And this is, you might have heard of Lenin's idea that there are two types of nationalism, a good one and a bad one. The nationalism of the oppressed, which is fine, and the nationalism, the aggressive nationalism, which we have to defeat. And this is a quote from Bauer here, you see, which he did in response to his argument with Kautsky in Die Neue Zeit, where he says we have to uncover the national content of the class struggle. Yeah? And obviously, from this, it is not too far a step to Lenin's idea that we must, we support the democratic content in the nationalism of the oppressed are the workers. Just he said oppressed nation. So this is another influence. And if you don't, maybe you haven't heard of this Leninist principle, but definitely you will have heard of this Stalinist slogan of socialist in content and nationalist in form. And that too is basically had been anticipated, prefigured by Kautsky, who, when he debated with the Austro-Marxists, who said to them, what are you talking about nationalism being such a real thing? It's just international culture in a national guise. It is just a matter of language. And he said, we have to distinguish between the content and the form. And he said, what I agree with you, Bauer, is that yes, we have to create the party and the state in a way that our propaganda will become international in its content, but national in its form. But that it will, meet the people with a national faith in their national native languages. And this is what Kautsky took away from Bauer, what he agreed on with Bauer, and this is what the Soviet Union would do, especially the early Soviet Union. And now I come to the end. Yes. This is basically the core, but you might have realized this Austro-Marxist premise. This is what Terry Martin calls the Marxist premise, the idea that you can disarm nationalism by granting forms of nationhood. Well, he thinks obviously more in terms of forms, in terms of national states and republics. But the theory here, or the rationale, the premise behind it, that you can disarm nationalism by providing forms of nationhood, was also Austro-Marxist. I mean, I just said, they said we have to battle fire with fire, beat nationalism on its own ground. We cannot let the bourgeoisie speak for the nation. We have to start speaking for the nation. And these are very general similarities. But if you look at the language and at the sources, you see that it is even, up to the same word. So it's not just happened to be the same situation. I don't think it was just same context leading to similar results. I think there was an influence. Stalin, Lenin, Bauer, Renner, all of them sought to ward off the nationalist threat to proletarian unity by providing forms of nationhood. They all cautioned the working class against national separatism, and they all believed that making the nation and national culture socialist objectives would avert the danger of national separatism to a socialist multinational state and party. So if Kasatkin, this is the conclusion, wrote to Stalin, I don't understand, I think we cannot really blame him. If you look at what the Lenin and Stalin had written before the revolution, and what they've written after it, especially during the 20s. Oh yeah, I'm coming to an end. I hear my echo. You see a gaping divide between us. You know, back then, he said the Austro-Marxists want to preserve national culture, organize nations, separate the humanity into different national groups. We cannot possibly do this. And in 1929, when Kasakin and others asked exactly those questions, saying, well, aren't we doing the wrong thing here? He said, no, you have to reconcile yourself to the party line. This is now our thing, national autonomy, national culture, and we're doing it. And the only difference really was, we're doing it temporarily. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matias. That was absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think, probably when they condemned people, it was for bourgeois nationalism. It wasn't for nationalism per se. So maybe that's an important point. But I'll throw the floor open to questions, please. Any questions at this point?
It was confusing. I'm sorry.
I could ask one.
Yeah, please, Carly.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really, really interesting and informative. Just as a matter of interest, the young men whose photos you showed, with all of these questions and suggestions, I was actually just wondering about the fates that befell them, because we know that typically making suggestions to these men in power didn't always end very well for those making the suggestions. Just that question.
Yeah, can you see my screen still?
Yeah.
Well, you see, because the dates are funny. At 37, he was obviously shocked at this great terror. He didn't, because he wasn't in the Soviet Union, but interestingly enough, died around the same time. He is also a victim of the Stalinist terror, and he isn't, but also died around the same time. I only realized that yesterday and found it interesting, and I was joking to my wife that maybe the other two died of disappointment and sadness. I don't know. But you're right, Kasakin, it didn't go well. Although he was right, because soon the affirmative action empire was really being toned down a little bit.
Yeah, but even in the longer term, that's debatable, though, isn't it? Because Stalin did change course, but the basic structures were never actually changed, But,
yeah. Yes, it's true. I mean, it was. I mean, this is what people say. Why do you even look at all of this? Obviously, these are politicians. They change their mind. They're pragmatists. They lie. Why do you take it seriously? You can argue that, but I think it did play the role. This theory.
Yeah, and there were long-term structural consequences to it. But Levente, you have a question, please.
Yes.
Try the microphone if it sometimes works. Is there
I can't hear.
I can relay the question unless it's a long one. Do you want to come to the front? Yeah.
I very much enjoyed both presentations, and I was a little bit stuck again about this experience, how little we know about backgrounds, about personal stories which have shaped many important consequential things in this history of majority-minority relations. Now, although I'm afraid I will declare my ignorance by the question I would like to frame, that I became interested realizing how much insight you have in the context of shaping state policies and important positions of personalities who have shaped very seriously, I would say, history. I became interested to ask you, in the literature of the idea of people's self-determination, there is a statement which says that the success of Woodrow Wilson in pushing the principle of people's self-determination on the agenda of international policy and putting the New World Order he was advocating for and working in the first in the peace system ending the First World War. His success was largely dependent on the support he received from Lenin, who on his side he was also interested in the principle of people's self-determination. Now, I have read this idea in several places. I don't know what is behind this statement, and since I realize that you know a lot, can you explain something? How does this tie into your story, in what you have just presented us?
Yes. No, it's, thank you that you think I know a lot. But I don't, especially not on this subject. So maybe Marina wants to answer that. All I want to say, she can think about it now, all I want to quickly say is that when I read the Soviet discourse on these questions, there very often is a comparison to the international, to the League of Nations, to self-determination, and there's always a conscious effort to try to compare them and see the Soviet version as obviously the right one. So I think you have to see those two together. I can't say anything about Lenin personally helping Woodrow Wilson, but I can say that what I just said. And maybe Marina has something to say to that. If not, you'd say you don't want.
Marina?
No, I must admit that I haven't come across the statements that Lorente just mentioned. I would be very interested to if you could share some references. But one thing, what I know is that although the Soviet Union was, Russia was not represented at the Paris Peace Conference, it was very much there in spirit, and of course the peacemakers took it into their account, and there were many ways that it envisioned influence.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at only at the impact of Lenin putting, espousing national self-determination and putting this, even more firmly on the international agenda during the First World War, I think, I don't think that can be underestimated. But yeah, I must go away and read more. Thank you.